I want you to imagine coming home on a random Tuesday and finding your whole life folded into 3 cardboard boxes on the porch. That's how mine started. Not with shouting. Not with tears. Just 3 boxes, taped shut, with my name written on top in my wife's handwriting. My name is Daniel Cross, and until 11 months ago, I thought I had a good life. A wife named Rachel. 2 kids, Emma and Noah. A steady job as an operations manager at a logistics company owned by a man named Victor Hale. I want to tell you exactly how Victor Hale destroyed my family, and what happened after, because even now, some nights, I still can't believe it's real. Let me back up. I met Rachel in college. She was studying business, I was studying supply chain management, and we fell into that easy kind of love where you don't remember the exact day it started, you just remember that one day you were friends and the next day you were building a life together. We got married young. Too young, some people said. But it worked, for a long time it really worked. We had Emma first, then Noah 2 years later. I took the job at Hale Logistics because it paid well, and Victor Hale himself interviewed me and told me I reminded him of himself when he was starting out. I believed him. I was flattered. I worked hard. I stayed late. I told myself I was building something for my family. Victor Hale was the kind of man who owned 3 houses and still complained about taxes. Silver hair, tailored suits, a laugh that filled a room and made you feel like you were the only person in it, until you weren't. He was 52. Rachel was 34. I never once thought about the 2 of them in the same sentence, not until the sentence was already written and I was the last one to read it. It started small. Company dinners where spouses were invited. Victor complimenting Rachel's dress, her cooking, her opinions on politics she barely followed but suddenly had strong feelings about after spending time with him. I thought he was just charming. I thought that's who Victor Hale was with everyone. I didn't know charm could be a weapon aimed directly at the person sleeping next to you. The first real sign came about 8 months before the boxes appeared on the porch. Rachel started going to a book club on Thursday nights. I never met the other women in this book club. I never saw a single book. When I asked what they were reading, she'd give me a title, and once, just once, I looked it up and found out it had been published 11 years earlier and was already out of print. She said the group was reading it as a classic. I let it go, because that's what you do when you love someone and you don't want to be the kind of husband who checks up on his wife like she's a suspect in his own house. By the way, if you've ever had that feeling, that quiet, sick feeling where some part of you already knows before the rest of you is ready to admit it, tell me in the comments, because I promise you, you're not alone, and if this channel has helped even one person feel less alone in a mess like mine, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more of this story to tell you, and trust me, it gets so much stranger than a fake book club. The second sign was money. Small amounts at first, gone from our joint account. 100 here. 200 there. Rachel said it was for gifts, groceries, things for the kids. I was working 60-hour weeks under Victor Hale, chasing a promotion he kept dangling in front of me like a carrot tied to a string only he was holding, so I didn't have the energy to argue over grocery receipts. That was my first real mistake. I traded attention for exhaustion, and exhaustion is exactly the kind of soil an affair grows best in. The third sign, the one that finally cracked something open in me, was a text message that came through on Rachel's phone while it was charging on the kitchen counter and I was making Noah's lunch for school. It lit up. I wasn't trying to look. I want to be honest with you, I wasn't some suspicious husband hunting for evidence. The screen just lit up in front of my face while I was spreading peanut butter on bread, and I saw a name I recognized. Victor. And underneath it, a preview of a message that I will never forget as long as I live, can't stop thinking about last night. He has no idea. I stood there with a butter knife in my hand for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 seconds. Emma was still asleep. Noah was watching cartoons in the next room. And I was standing in my own kitchen learning that my wife and my boss were sleeping together, from a text message that lit up like a small, cruel firework. I didn't confront her that morning. I want to explain why, because people always ask me why I waited. I waited because I needed proof that couldn't be explained away, because I knew Rachel, and I knew if I came at her with one text message, she would turn it around on me, make me feel crazy, make me feel like the villain for looking at her phone. So I became patient. I became careful. For 6 weeks, I collected everything. I found hotel charges on a credit card I didn't know she still had open, one from years before we got serious, a card in her maiden name that Victor's company, coincidentally, had once used for corporate expenses. I found a second phone, hidden in the lining of her gym bag, an old cracked phone that only had one contact and one thread of messages going back 14 months. 14 months. That was longer than I wanted to think about. I found calendar entries labeled with initials that weren't book club, weren't yoga, weren't anything but a code for stolen hours with my boss. And through all of this, at work, Victor Hale kept smiling at me. Kept telling me I was next in line for regional director. Kept asking about my kids by name, Emma and Noah, using their names like he had any right to know them at all. Every single day I sat across a conference table from the man who was destroying my marriage, and every single day he shook my hand like we were building something together. I have never in my life felt so much rage wrapped inside so much silence. I finally confronted Rachel on a Sunday evening after the kids were asleep. I laid it all out on our kitchen table, the hotel receipts, the printed screenshots, dates that matched perfectly with nights she told me she was at that fictional book club. I expected shock. I expected denial. I expected her to cry and beg for forgiveness the way people do in movies. What I got instead was worse. She went quiet for a long moment, and then she looked at me with something close to relief, like a weight had finally been put down, and she said, "I was wondering when you'd finally notice." Not sorry. Not I made a mistake. Just, I was wondering when you'd finally notice, like I was the slow one, like I had failed some test by not catching my own wife and my own boss sooner. She told me she'd fallen in love with Victor. She told me he made her feel like her life meant something. She told me our marriage had been dead for years and I just hadn't been paying attention, which felt rich coming from a woman who'd been paying very close attention to another man's hotel room while I was working 60-hour weeks trying to give her a life she apparently despised. 2 weeks after that conversation, I was called into Victor Hale's office. I remember every detail of that room, the dark wood desk, the window overlooking the parking lot where my old sedan sat between 2 company trucks, the framed photo of Victor shaking hands with some senator at a charity gala. He told me the company was restructuring my department. He told me it was nothing personal. He told me this while wearing a tie I now knew Rachel had bought him, because I'd seen the receipt on one of those hidden statements, purchased on our joint credit card the week before, disguised in the records as office supplies. I lost my job that day. 3 weeks later, Rachel filed for divorce and asked for primary custody, citing my long work hours and, in her words, my emotional unavailability. The court, weighing a man who now had no job against a woman who could point to a wealthy new partner and a stable household, leaned in her direction for temporary custody while things were sorted out. I lost my job, and within 2 months I had lost the house too, because without my income we couldn't keep up the mortgage, and Rachel had already moved into a property that, surprise, surprise, belonged to Victor Hale. I want to pause here and just say, if you're watching this and you've ever felt like the whole world flipped against you overnight through no real fault of your own, I understand that feeling more than I can put into words. And if this story is hitting something in you, subscribe to the channel, because I read every comment, and honestly, hearing from people who've survived their own version of this has kept me going more than you know. So there I was. No job. No house. Limited time with my own kids. And one final text message from Rachel that I still have saved, word for word: "You'll die broke and lonely." She sent that to me the same week I was signing papers to move into a storage facility, because a storage unit was the only thing I could afford that had 4 walls and a door that locked. The storage facility was on the edge of town, a long row of orange metal doors under a flickering light that buzzed all night like it was mocking me. My unit was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and I set up a cot, a camping stove, and a single lamp, and told myself this was temporary, this was rock bottom, and rock bottom only goes up from here. I had almost nothing left from my old life except a box of things from my Uncle Walter, my father's older brother, who had passed away 6 months before all of this happened. Uncle Walter had been a strange, quiet man. He never married, never had kids of his own, spent most of his life traveling for work that he never talked about in detail, something in imports and shipping. He always said, in that vague way older relatives sometimes talk about their careers like the details don't matter. He left me a small inheritance when he died, just under $4,000, and a storage unit rental he'd been paying on for years, a unit 2 rows down from the one I ended up renting for myself, in the exact same facility, which even at the time struck me as one of those strange little coincidences life throws at you right when you're not looking for meaning in anything. I hadn't touched Uncle Walter's unit yet. I kept meaning to, kept telling myself I'd deal with it once things settled down, but things never settled down, they just kept falling apart faster. It was on my 3rd night sleeping on that cot, staring at the ceiling of my own storage unit, that I finally walked the 2 rows over with a flashlight and a set of keys the facility manager had given me, and unlocked my dead uncle's storage unit for the first time. Inside, past a layer of old furniture covered in sheets and boxes of yellowed newspapers, I found an old leather briefcase, locked, sitting on top of a metal filing cabinet like it had been placed there deliberately, waiting. And taped to the top of it, in handwriting I recognized instantly as my uncle's careful, old-fashioned script, was an envelope with my name on it. Daniel. My hands were shaking when I opened that envelope. Inside was a short letter, and I'm going to tell you almost exactly what it said, because I've read it so many times I could probably recite it in my sleep. It said, "Daniel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and things in your life have likely gotten hard enough that you finally opened this old box. I always knew you were the one in the family with a good heart and not enough people around you who deserved it. What's inside this briefcase is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address." And below that was an address I didn't recognize, somewhere 2 states away, along with a small brass key. I forced the briefcase open with a crowbar I borrowed from the facility manager, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Inside was $60,000 in cash, bundled in neat stacks, a plane ticket already booked for 3 days later, and a folded piece of paper with that same handwritten line, "This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address." I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time, just staring at the money, at the ticket, at my dead uncle's handwriting, trying to understand what kind of life Walter had actually lived that he could leave $60,000 in cash sitting in a locked briefcase like it was nothing more than a tip left on a table. I flew out 3 days later, using the ticket exactly as instructed. The address led me to a private holding company office in a city I'd never visited, run by a small, sharp-eyed attorney named Ms. Alvarez, who had apparently been waiting for someone matching my description to walk through that door for the better part of 6 months. She sat me down, slid a folder across the desk, and told me that my Uncle Walter hadn't spent his life in imports and shipping, the way he always vaguely described. He had spent nearly 3 decades quietly building a private investment company, mostly in maritime logistics and overseas shipping contracts, a company that, through patents on a container tracking system he had personally invented and later licensed out to nearly every major shipping firm on the West Coast, was worth just over $100 million. And in his will, filed and sealed for exactly this kind of moment, every share of that company, every asset, every account, was left entirely to me. I actually laughed out loud in that office, a strange, broken laugh, because it felt so impossible that a week earlier I'd been sleeping on a cot in a storage unit after losing my wife, my job, and nearly my kids, and now a lawyer in a quiet office was telling me I was, on paper, worth more money than I could fully process. But here's the part one need you to understand, because this isn't a story about money making everything better, not really. What I felt in that moment wasn't triumph. It was grief, actually, because the first thing I wanted to do was call my uncle and thank him, and I couldn't, because he was gone, and he'd spent his last months quietly building an escape hatch for a nephew he must have somehow known was going to need one. If you're still with me, this is usually where I remind people watching to hit that subscribe button, because the next part of this story, what happened when I finally faced Victor Hale and Rachel again, is honestly the part people message me about the most, so stick around. I spent the next 4 months quietly learning the business my uncle left me, working with Ms. Alvarez and the small executive team Walter had trusted for years, people who, once they understood who I was, treated me not like some lucky nephew but like the rightful heir to something they'd all helped build. I didn't tell Rachel. I didn't tell Victor. I didn't tell anyone outside of a very small circle, including my own attorney handling the ongoing custody case, who I instructed to simply state that my financial situation had significantly improved, without giving specifics, because I wanted to see exactly how this would play out on its own. And it played out beautifully, in the darkest, most satisfying way I could have imagined. See, Victor Hale's company, Hale Logistics, the very company that had fired me, relied heavily on shipping contracts and container tracking systems for its West Coast operations. The same patented tracking system my uncle had invented decades earlier. The very system now owned, entirely, by me. I didn't do anything dramatic at first. I simply had my legal team review every existing licensing contract Hale Logistics held with my uncle's company, contracts that, it turned out, were coming up for renewal in exactly 6 weeks. I let that renewal date get closer and closer while Victor Hale, completely unaware that the quiet, obscure holding company he needed to negotiate with was now run by the man he'd fired and humiliated, sent his usual mid-level procurement team to handle what he assumed would be a routine renewal. When Victor Hale finally realized who he was actually negotiating with, because eventually someone has to sign the final documents in person, and that someone turned out to be me, walking into his conference room in a suit that cost more than his monthly car payment, I watched the color drain out of that man's face in real time. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most satisfying moments of my entire life. He actually stood up halfway out of his chair, like his body wanted to run before his brain had caught up with what was happening. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest with you, I thought I would gloat, I'd imagined this moment 100 times lying on that cot in the storage unit, but when it actually happened, I found I didn't need to say much at all. I simply informed him, calmly, that given recent developments in our business relationship, and given certain personal history between us, my company would not be renewing the licensing agreement his logistics firm depended on, effective in 90 days. 90 days was enough time, legally, to be fair. It was not enough time for a company as leveraged as his to quickly replace a core piece of technology across an entire West Coast fleet. Hale Logistics lost nearly 40% of its shipping efficiency within 4 months of that contract ending. I heard, later, through people who still worked there, that Victor Hale personally called Ms. Alvarez's office 3 separate times trying to negotiate an exception, an emergency extension, anything. Each time, he was told, politely and formally, that the decision was final. Rachel, for her part, found out who I'd become around the same time the rest of the business world did, when a small trade publication ran a piece about the quiet inheritance behind my uncle's shipping patents, my name printed clearly next to the headline. I got a text message from her that same week. Not an apology. Just 3 words, we should talk. I did eventually talk to her, once, in a mediator's office as part of finalizing custody arrangements, because whatever had happened between us, Emma and Noah still needed both their parents functioning like adults. Rachel tried, in that meeting, to suggest that maybe we should reconsider things, now that my circumstances had changed, and I remember looking at her, really looking at her, and realizing that the man she'd cheated with had already, quietly, started distancing himself from her the moment his company started struggling, because Victor Hale, it turned out, was the kind of man who only stayed loyal to whoever was winning. I told Rachel that our marriage had ended the day she decided a text message and a locked bedroom door meant more to her than the life we'd built, and no amount of money changing hands would rewrite that. What I focused on instead, what actually mattered, was making sure Emma and Noah had stability, a home that wasn't dependent on anyone's business deals, and a father who showed up for every recital and every soccer game, which I now, finally, had the time and freedom to do. I moved into a modest house near their school, not a mansion, because I didn't want my kids growing up thinking money was the point of any of this. I kept working, quietly expanding what my uncle built, but I made sure Emma and Noah never once felt like an afterthought again. Victor Hale's company eventually sold off most of its shipping division at a steep loss less than a year after our meeting. Rachel and Victor's relationship, from what I understand through mutual acquaintances, didn't survive the financial strain either, which I won't pretend didn't feel like a strange, quiet kind of justice. Sometimes I still think about that first night in the storage unit, lying on a cot under a flickering light, absolutely certain that my life was over. I think about how close I came to never opening my uncle's unit at all, how I kept putting it off, how easily I could have just stayed focused on my own collapse and never noticed the door 2 rows down that had been waiting for me the whole time. I think about the note in his careful handwriting, "This is just travel money, the real fortune is waiting at this address," and how he somehow knew, even from wherever he is now, that I would need somewhere to go. I don't tell this story to brag about money, because honestly, the money was never the real fortune, not the way I understand it now. The real fortune was getting my footing back. Watching my kids laugh in a home that's actually stable. Learning, the hardest way possible, exactly what loyalty is worth and exactly what it isn't. If there's one thing I want you to take from all of this, it's that the worst chapter of your life is not always the last chapter, sometimes it's just the door you have to walk through to find out what was waiting for you all along. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one coming, real, raw, and honest, and I promise you, some of them go even further than this one did. Thank you for listening to mine.